Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
All right. Okay, so everyone has some food. Everyone has some food, hopefully, and some drinks. You can keep eating and you can talk, but want to make sure you guys are fed, hopefully, and happy, and make it through the rest of this evening, and make sure you show up for tomorrow morning. So not too late tonight. But this is something new. We're trying this just here to have some of the talks in the evening, along with the dinner. So appreciate your feedback after this on how well it goes. I want to have 3 talks this evening. Following Dr. Korn's talk, we'll have 2 from some Microsoft people. Actually, Kirill's not going to be coming, but it'll be Marvin Thiemer will be actually doing the HPC talk, and then Savas will be doing the work that he actually did in Newcastle previously to coming to Microsoft and talk about that. But I'd like to actually introduce first Dr. Milton Korn from NIH, Assistant Director there, and he's going to give us some info on what's going on at NIH. So appreciate it.
I'm competing with mussels and beer here. I don't think that's going to be too successful, but unlike some of the others here, in fact, unlike all the others here, I have nothing actually to show you as an accomplishment. I am from the National Library of Medicine, and I think some of the things we did have been mentioned here today. GenBank, UMLS, we funded Gully Burns, and other things, but the idea here is not to tell good things that the NIH has done, but to tell you that we really need the type of expertise that I think the people who are attending this workshop actually are able to offer. I think the type of science that's done by the National Institutes of Health, Biology and Medicine, is actually coming up against the wall, and unless we embrace computation as a serious and I think probably permanent collaboration, we're going to have a lot of Brownian movement over the next few years. It hasn't always been like that. I think biology was perhaps the last of the sciences to actually put much credence in computation. When I first came to NIH in the early 90s, I think the only institute that had any interest in computation was the National Library of Medicine, actually, which was using it for PubMed and things of that sort. The genome made the difference, as I think most people know. Suddenly, the presence of enormous and large data sets got people's attention. And then in the late 90s, there was a conversion on the road to Damascus, so to speak, and now there's a great deal of activity. A great deal of interest, and I think there are a number of people who want to collaborate to bring computation in what they're doing, but I think there's a good bit of uncertainty about how to do it. And on the other hand, I think there's a lot of uncertainty on the part of people who are computationally sophisticated about just what NIH wants and whether, in fact, it's worthwhile working with the institutes and how to go about it if one does it. So my relatively brief remarks here will be to give you a little primer on some things that are happening with us, and in the hope that some of you will have enough interest in it to try to pursue this further. You've heard plenty of examples of computation in medicine. There aren't nearly as many as I wish there were. You heard some this afternoon. I've just listed a few here. It's not an exhaustive list, but I don't want to pretend that this is a small sample out of tens of thousands because we simply have not been taking advantage of computation. These are some which we help support, we collectively, the National Institutes of Health, probably in fairly recent years. And I think it's just the beginning of what is going to be a really large stream of important findings. Just a few definitions, because there isn't much congruence on what bioinformatics and computational biology mean, and we didn't probably get it right either, in the sense that we have the gold standard. We were so, as a group, unsophisticated about the field that a committee was actually formed in the late 90s, actually 1999, to see if we could arrive at some definition about what bioinformatics and computational biology really are supposed to mean as terms. And I'm simply going to tell you what the NIH committee came up with, not because it agrees with what you're doing, but if you're going to be looking at NIH announcements and so on, it's probably good to keep in mind what these definitions were. This one is probably not in the mainstream, but it's relatively easy because boiled down, if you look at the second bullet, it basically says that computational biology is modeling, and everything else is bioinformatics. In practice, the terms are not used with any particular semantic precision there either, and one does hear biomedical computing, digital biology, and all the phrases that you probably hear at your own organizations as well. But this is the holy writ in terms of the official jargon. A little bit about NIH. Most of you probably know this, but it's quite important for anyone who's interested in working on NIH projects or in trying to get some funding for projects from the NIH, that there isn't any NIH. There is a big campus. We have a lot of people who are very friendly with each other, but in fact we have 27 semi-autonomous institutes. We have a director, and he is in fact highly respected and a very important person for all of us, but actually each of the institutes has its own budget, decides what its own research agenda is, announces its own programs, and makes its own funding decisions, which makes life difficult for people who would like to know what's going on in terms of funding opportunities, because it's not easy to know what 27 different organizations have out there at any given time. For computational purposes, we've been dividing the institutes actually into two major categories, of which the second so far has been doing most of the computational funding. The first one are the ones that have a disease or a theme of some kind, the categorical institutes, cancer, heart, infectious disease, and so on. The so-called cross-cutting institutes, the National Library and the other acronyms here, is a much smaller number, rather significant amount of funds available, and they're considered the ones who are more interested in computation, have come up with a great deal more money for this, and at the moment are probably providing most of the computational infrastructure that's being built for biomedical projects. Some jargon about the NIH. Probably the two biggest buzzwords under which computational projects are subsumed are BISTI, as the first one. It's now a frozen epithet. There probably aren't 6 people on the campus know what it stands for anymore. Now you know, briefly, because I'm putting it here. But it initially was a white paper for the director of the NIH, prepared by Botstein and Smar in 1998 when Harold Varmus was here, and it really was the call for the revolution. I think the place was a little sleepy about computers until that paper came along, and there's been a lot of activity since then. Because computation doesn't really belong to one institute rather than the other, we've needed some organizational changes to try to react for this. And BISTI is now the name of a a pan-NIH center which attempts to coordinate and keep track of computational projects. It's housed in the Institute for General Medical Sciences, but in fact it coordinates activities of a number of institutes. It actually issues some announcements for projects that it's interested in, and it has its own website. I've listed that here because for anyone who would like to take a quick look at one-stop shopping for what actually might be available in terms of funding or support for projects, this is probably the single best site. The roadmap is the other buzzword. I haven't heard it here today, but it's fairly well known. It had a spread in Science, Newsweek, and so on. It actually was an initiative of the current NIH director, Elias Zerhouni, and I think he recognized that 27 autonomous institutes can get a lot done, but there are a number of things that fall between the cracks, and he was interested in research issues that simply didn't fit the mission statement of any of the 27 institutes we have. And he came up with a series of projects and came up with some funds for them, and he is funding them in a number of different areas, but the main themes really had to do with, among other things of importance here, is new ways of doing science, and he was particularly focused on the need for interdisciplinary projects in which biomedical scientists and computational scientists, as well as social scientists and people from other fields, would start working together. I think there's a belief, probably a minority belief, but a belief that many of us have, which is that team science of some kind is probably where an awful lot of the important results are going to come from in the future. In general, while there are a lot of roadmap projects, computation is a very important part of almost all of them, and the interdisciplinary issue is considered so important that it has a number of training programs for it. We ourselves didn't think that most of the biologists that we were funding and physicians actually were very good at team science, and many of them are not interested in it. And we thought that it probably would take some nurturing to try to see whether interdisciplinary teams would in fact be successful and could make a go of it, and we don't know the results of that as yet. Some centers will be funded this year, specifically for interdisciplinary science. We've just finished funding 7 national centers for biomedical computing across the country, and each one of these had to, as an element of the competition, indicate which computer scientists and which biologists and which clinical researchers would be involved in doing this and how they would interact and so on. It's all a very interesting, rich mixture that we're working with, and I think we'll probably know more in another 4 or 5 years about whether we're actually able to foster, facilitate a collaboration of this sort. We know it has to be done, and it may be that we haven't picked the best way of doing it, but we rather thought that just waiting for life to take its course would take much too long because of the normal inertia of any scientist who's comfortable with what he's doing. It's worked for him since Bacon, who was mentioned earlier today, and he probably thinks it'll certainly last out his career, but in fact, we think it won't. This is another website, and it's another interesting source of funding for a rather interesting group of projects that have heavy computational component. I didn't hear systems biology mentioned here today. I think probably most of you have heard about it. I think it's conceptually very exciting. It's not possible to do without an enormous contribution and collaboration with computational specialists. And I think it has the intellectually exciting idea that biology may, for the first time, be able to complement 500 years of reductionist science with looking at systems. We haven't been able to do much of that. All of you know that there are almost no general laws in biology, certainly very few that can be captured in mathematics, and very few that are predictive of anything. And I think the successes of reductive science, genome is simply one example of that, are marvelous. But I think people are now starting to look at what happens when you put systems together, how do they operate, and so on. I don't think anyone with the IQ of a safety pin thinks that looking at all the elements of a cell gives the faintest indication of how the cell works, reproduces, or anything else. This has two major components in the places where this is being tried. There's an experimental arm because we really don't know many of the subsystems that are involved in cells, as one example. And then the second attempt will be to try to actually get some mathematical modeling with the hopes that we not only can capture at least rough approximations of what's going on, but that we'll be able to use them for predictive purposes. I think it's very exciting. I think the phrase is used much more often than it's understood, and probably a Google hit on that will give you a number of different explanations of it. But I think if there's any one concept that carries with it a need to have biomedical scientists and computational people work together, it's certainly systems biology. It's not possible without both of them being heavily involved with this. And then the last sort of buzz phrase that's of great importance to us and also carries with it an implication of major computational involvement is translational research. The genome, which is simply a placeholder as a term for all the other omics. I think every literate American, or every literate person at least in the West, knows that the genome actually was a fine achievement, but it really didn't explain a great deal, and that to actually get it to have some meaning for health, I mean, this is the National Institutes of Health, after all, the genome is not going to by itself make a huge contribution. And as Francis Collins has said, by genomics now he means proteomics, metabolomics, other omics, and so on, which are turning out to be unbelievably complex, very difficult to work with, but that's the way, that's what's making life happen. And this is where the work is going to be done. We also, it won't surprise you, we're a federal agency, and the Congress, while it is happy to congratulate us for the genome, really wants to know what we're doing that's useful in the intensive care unit. And from time to time, we need to be reminded of that, actually. But there's a lot of effort going into translational research now. The roadmap alone is doing it. It's very hard to do this, but what it really means is to try to take basic science, genome, proteomics, and so on, and see what this can do for the health of the public, what it can do for clinical medicine. These are just some of the examples. As a matter of fact, these are some of the low-hanging fruit that people are working at. These are designer drugs, not medically designer drugs. Early markers of disease, predicting life events. Microarrays have been mentioned here today. They're being done all over the place. There's microarray data probably sitting in every major medical center with people wondering what to do with it, actually. But in general, making this happen is a fascinating and extraordinarily important milestone, I think, for biology, because it not only has serious and very difficult computational problems, translational research, but it introduces things that were also brought up here today, social issues, privacy, human use issues, whether we'll be able, in fact, to use electronic medical records for scientific purposes. It's really tied into the fabric of the culture. So we have an interesting example of an unrivaled opportunity to make enormous strides in healing, but to do this will not only be difficult for science, it's going to be difficult for computation, and it will be difficult for the culture and the social system to work it out. I don't know how this will go. It may be that it will be very difficult to take full advantage of all of this. Privacy concerns are genuine, and they carry quite a lot of weight on the Hill, and we'll have to just see how this is. Just getting genomic data on people at our medical centers is already creating extraordinary difficulties in safeguarding the data for reasons that all of us would have sympathy for. Now, if you were interested in whether you had anything that we might want, you can look at those websites that I showed you. There are other ways to, I think, drill down and get a little more detailed information, and you can really find out what we're funding. Now, it may well be that you will look at what we're funding and think we really don't know what we're doing, but it doesn't matter. That's what it is, and at least at the moment. So I think as the first cut, you can do some of the things I'm suggesting here just to get a look at it. Probably a little bit more useful than fiddling with PubMed would be the third bullet here. If you, in fact, go to the BISTI website, whose URL I have here, it'll show you what actually got funded by all these, after all these announcements that we put out. And it doesn't mean you're limited to that, but I think it'll give you some idea of the alpha and omega of where we've been going so far. I think, in fact, you'll find that it's rather a broad spread of things. And, of course, if you do look at it, you not only will see the topics that have been covered, but it'll give you some idea of what people have been funded, and it'll give you a chance to look at it and say, they gave money to him? I can't believe that. All right, here are some. I'm not going to explain these. Can you read that red? Yes. This is just to have you look at the titles, because they're open now. These are all competitions that are open now and are soliciting applications. What's underneath the hood in each of these is, of course, varied, and you'd have to read the announcement to see if there's anything there that scratches your itch. But I think, in general, you can see it's fairly broad. It would be hard to think of somebody who, with a great computational expertise, who couldn't find a place here where he's needed. Just take a look at them. It's not all genomics. I was very happy to hear here that there was a lot of interest in imaging, which is a difficult and very interesting field of its own. Heterogeneous data sources is a problem for everybody everywhere. The last one is an example of something that's increasing more and more. We're partnering more and more with the National Science Foundation, and in fact with DOE on this particular one, and some of you probably were involved in this one because it just finished the first round a few months ago. Now, those were for individuals, these. I mean, you're sitting here, or you and a coworker, and you can go apply for these. I'd like to separate out the ones where you really can become a collaborator with people. And these are the centers. And we have had a spate of centers being funded in the last few years. And I, as simply one, but there are others too, I'm not sure how good idea centers are. They're an easy way to spend money. They're attractive on a blackboard. How well they work in actuality is quite variable. We have a long experience with cancer centers, and some of them have been brilliant, and some of them have been pedestrian. And we're hoping that these will all be brilliant, or at least middle of the road. Every single one of these, from the get-go, had to have large computational components, and in terms of the budget involved, I'd say of the sums given to these centers, and they're quite large for NIH, and some of them, they vary between 2 to 7, in one case $12 million a year, which is not chump change, and 25 to 40% of the budget had to go for computational purposes. So there are opportunities in these things. The reason I bring this up is that if you really don't know how to get going, but you're at a place that has one of these centers, you have a ready-made opportunity to go and introduce yourself to some people, because otherwise there's no good dating bureau for how you meet partners with whom to work. I'll touch on that when I finish, what will be in a moment. There's more on this slide than I really want to tell you about, except that I've been focusing on things we're soliciting. You don't need to wait for that. The majority of the projects we do fund traditionally are unsolicited, investigator-originated applications, and there's no reason why a computational specialist with a good idea can't do that too. It's not necessary to wait for an invitation. You can send an unsolicited application. And if you do so, your success rate actually, historically, is about as good as the people who do apply. Our success rate is certainly a lot better than it is for NSF at the moment, for budget reasons and other reasons. We generally try to stay in the neighborhood of 20% success rate, plus or minus a little. We're not that this year. We're probably closer to, at the National Library, we're at 9%. Some of the other institutes are in the teens. I think that's temporary, having to do with the doubling of the budget. And I think in general, the success rate for applications will be in the high teens or 20%. You might like to see it better, but it does mean that there's a reasonable chance. And if you send in a revised application, which we permit 2 revised applications, success rate goes up closer to 28 or 30%. It's not bad odds. I don't think anyone in this room thinks 100% of the applications really deserve federal funding. I do think, though, that if you're not applying to a solicitation, talk to somebody. It's a lot of work to prepare an application, a lot more work than for an NSF application. And try to find an institute and a program contact you can talk to and say, you know what, I'd like to do this. Send them an email or call them and say, what do you think? Got any chance? My last URL on this slide actually has a list of the computational contacts for every one of the institutes. I'm going to post this on our website. So you may not need the rest of this talk, but if you have any interest in any of the URLs, you'll be able to pick them up later. And then another way I think that you can get some information that might be of interest is who's doing the reviewing for computational projects. And I don't want to go the whole 10 steps to the review group, but you should know that unlike other agencies, we have a different group that does the reviewing. The institutes don't usually do their own reviewing. And if you go to CSR, the Center for Scientific Review, you can find out all the review groups. Some of them have computation in their name. And if you're all very experienced with browsers and websites, and if you drill around a little bit, you'll get some idea of what people are being selected to do the reviewing, and certainly help you with trying to jockey around which review group your application will go to. I'm not going to tell you how to do that here, but it's not hard with a little coaching. If you've never written a grant to the NIH, talk to somebody who has. NSF experience is not particularly useful, and I'm going to repeat some things in closing here that I think you heard from others today. I mean, this is a very intelligent group of people. Please don't think that because you know how to apply your techniques to some set of data you've worked on, that the biologists are a group of not particularly bright people sitting there in a pool of data, and all they need is your technique, because it won't work, and it will look like a very unsophisticated application. As was said by someone else, you have to look as if you know something about the biology domain. And if you haven't done it before, get somebody from the field. Even a brilliant, unsolicited application from a computer person draws great skepticism by the NIH review groups if there's no physician or biologist involved. And this is my last one, really. Suppose you want to do this and you don't know how to find somebody. These are just some things you can try. If you're at a medical center, the director-sponsored research might tell you who's working in the field you're looking at. The others speak for themselves. I'm not going to go over these bullets. But the last one maybe deserves a little bit of information. It's not too good to do most of the project on your own and then try to find somebody who will sort of be a fig leaf for you. It works on both sides that you should work. The partnership should start early in the project. And then lastly, this is my name. If I've gone over something semi-incoherently, but you have any interest in it, by all means, email me. And then the material in this talk, we will put it up on our website, which is actually the National Library of Medicine website, the extramural program bulletin. And I really appreciate your attention during dinner. That must be very hard to do. Thank you. All right. Let me take this off. Here you go.
Great. Thank you very much, James.